Particular kind of quiet that settles over a house after 41 years of marriage, not the silence of emptiness, the silence of someone who knows every creak in the floorboards, every hiss of the radiator, every sound that means him. I had that quiet for so long I stopped noticing it, until the night my husband reached across the dinner table, covered my hand with his, and said, very softly, like he was telling me a secret, I need you to move everything into your name, all of it. Tonight if you can. I remember putting down my fork. We were having chicken, the kind with lemon and thyme that he'd always liked, the recipe I'd been making since our first apartment in Guelph, back when we had nothing but a used mattress and a cast iron pan we found at a garage sale. He'd eaten half his plate. He looked, I don't know how to describe it, not sick exactly, tired in a way that went deeper than tired. I asked him what he meant. He said, the RSPs, the joint accounts, the house, the rental property on Elmwood, move it, all of it, into your name alone. He'd been a careful man his whole life. 41 years, and I had never once heard him speak carelessly about money. He built his business from a single truck and a service contract with the regional municipality. By the time he was 62, he had 14 trucks, 12 employees, and a contract worth more than I'd ever thought possible when we were young and hopeful and eating chicken on mismatched plates. So when he said something like that, quietly, deliberately, the way he said things that mattered, I listened. Is something wrong? I asked. He squeezed my hand. Just do it for me, will you? Before the end of the week. I didn't sleep that night. I lay beside him listening to him breathe, and I told myself I was overreacting, that he was probably just tired, probably just had something on his mind about the business. Men do that, I told myself. They carry things, and they don't tell you why. I went to the bank the next morning anyway. Then I called our solicitor in Kitchener and started the paperwork on the property transfers. My husband sat at the kitchen table and signed everything I put in front of him. He didn't explain. He just signed. He died 4 days later. A massive stroke. He was in the garage doing nothing more dangerous than checking the tire pressure on his truck, and then he was on the concrete floor, and by the time the paramedics arrived, there was nothing anyone could do. He was 67 years old. He had never been to a cardiologist in his life. He believed in hard work and stubbornness more than he believed in doctors. And I had argued with him about that for 20 years, and it hadn't mattered, and now it would never matter again. I won't try to describe those first days. Anyone who has lost the person who was the center of their life knows that grief isn't something you can explain to people who haven't felt it. It's not crying, though you cry. It's not pain, though it hurts. It's more like the floor has disappeared and you're standing anyway, and you don't know how. My son called the morning after the funeral, not to ask how I was. He called to ask about the will. I sat in the kitchen with my coffee going cold, and I listened to him ask very carefully, very politely, in the voice I recognized from when he was a teenager trying to get something he knew I'd say no to, whether I'd had a chance to look at his father's documents, whether there were things that needed to be sorted out. Your father has only been buried 24 hours, I said. There was a pause. Then, I know, Mum. I just want to make sure you're not overwhelmed. These things get complicated. He was 40 years old. He worked in commercial real estate in Mississauga. He had his father's jawline and none of his father's patience. I told him I was fine. I told him I would call him when I was ready. He came over anyway, 3 days after the funeral. He brought his wife Cassandra, a woman I had tried for 15 years to genuinely love and had managed, at best, to tolerate. She carried a dish of something covered in foil and set it on my counter, and then stood in my kitchen with her arms crossed and let my son do the talking. He sat across from me at the same table where his father had told me to move everything. He had a folder. He put it on the table. Dad's business assets, he said. We need to talk about how the transition is going to work." I looked at the folder. What transition? The company, the trucks, the contracts. He glanced at Cassandra. Dad always said the business would come to me. You know that. You were there when he said it. I did know that my husband had spoken, years ago, about eventually bringing our son into the business. What I also knew was that our son had never once shown any interest in waste management, that he had taken his father's offers of partnership and declined them repeatedly over the years in favor of his real estate career, and that my husband, in the last conversation we'd ever had about it, maybe 2 years before he died, had told me quietly that he'd accepted it wasn't going to happen. Your father's business belongs to me now, I said. He transferred everything into my name. The expression on my son's face changed, just for a moment, just a flicker, before he pulled it back into something more careful. When did he do that? Just before he died. Cassandra uncrossed her arms. She said, That's not legally, was he in a sound state of mind when he did that? I put my hands flat on the table. I looked at my daughter-in-law very steadily. He was sound enough to sign legal documents in front of a solicitor and 2 witnesses, I said. If you have a concern about that, you're welcome to take it up with our solicitor. His name is on the letterhead. They left an hour later. The dish Cassandra had brought sat on my counter untouched. I didn't touch it after they left either. I put it in the garbage. What happened over the next 6 weeks I can only describe as a slow unwrapping, like a package that looked ordinary from the outside and turned out, layer by layer, to contain something you never expected. My solicitor called me first. He said there'd been an inquiry from a law firm in Toronto, a firm that specialized in estate challenges, asking questions about my husband's capacity at the time of the asset transfers. My solicitor said very calmly that he had responded with the documentation and that the inquiry had no merit. He also said, less calmly, that I should probably know the inquiry had come from my son. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called my husband's accountant, a man named Barry who had done our books for 22 years, and I asked him to pull everything. Every account, every transaction, every filing going back 3 years. I didn't tell him why. Barry had known my husband since before our son was born. He didn't ask. What Barry found took him a week to put together. When he came to the house and sat at my kitchen table and laid it out, I had to ask him to go through it twice because I couldn't quite hold it in my head the first time. For the past 3 years, someone had been using a secondary email account, an account my husband had never mentioned, attached to a name that was almost but not quite his, to correspond with 2 of our major municipal contracts. The emails, when Barry showed them to me, were careful. They had never asked for anything outright. They had simply created doubt. Small questions about whether my husband was still the right person to manage the contracts. Suggestions that perhaps the municipality might want to begin an informal review. The kind of subtle interference that doesn't look like interference unless you know what you're looking at. One of the email addresses those messages had been sent from was traceable to a server registered to a numbered company. The numbered company, when Barry's contact followed the thread, was connected to a holding company. The holding company had one director, my son. I drove to the OPP detachment in Orangeville on a Tuesday morning in November. I brought Barry, I brought the printed records, and I brought our solicitor. The officer who took my statement was a woman about 10 years younger than my son. She listened to everything without expression, took the documents, and told me she would be in touch. I drove home through the gray November countryside, and I thought about the night my husband had asked me to move everything. I thought about the way he'd held my hand. I thought about how he'd said just to be safe. 3 small words that I'd understood to mean I'm not feeling well. I understood now that they'd meant something else entirely. He'd known. Not about the stroke. No one could have known that. But he'd known something was shifting. He'd known his son was shifting. He'd known his son was being built against him. 41 years of watching that boy, of knowing how he thought, of loving him in spite of it. And in the end, my husband had understood before I did what kind of man our son had become. My son called me in December. His voice was different, tighter, something frightened underneath. He said he just wanted to talk. He said he was sorry for the way things had gone after the funeral. He said he'd been grieving and not handling it well. I let him talk. Then I said, I know about the emails. The silence on the line was the longest I had ever heard from him. I don't know what you're. The municipal contracts. 3 years. The numbered company. I kept my voice very even. I know. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed completely. He said, Mum, you have to understand, Dad was. Don't, I said. I had thought that moment would feel like something, like grief or rage or satisfaction. It didn't feel like any of those things. It felt like a door closing. The OPP investigation took 7 months. My son retained the Toronto firm, and there were lawyers and documents and things I signed and things I read and didn't fully understand, and things Barry explained to me and things my solicitor explained after Barry. Cassandra, it emerged fairly early, had been aware of the scheme and had helped establish the numbered company, though her direct involvement was harder to prove. The charge that ultimately stuck for both of them was fraud. The deliberate interference with commercial contracts by misrepresentation. My solicitor explained that it was not, in the end, about what they'd tried to take from me after my husband died. It was about what they'd been trying to take from him, from us, while he was still alive. My son was sentenced to 3 years. Cassandra received 18 months to be served conditionally. They lost the house in Mississauga. It had apparently been purchased partially with funds from a line of credit secured against the business, a detail that came out in the financial review and that neither of them had ever disclosed to me. I didn't go to the sentencing. My solicitor offered to come with me. Barry offered to come with me. My neighbor Gwen, who had been bringing me casseroles since the week my husband died and who had become, in that year, one of the closest friends I have ever had. Gwen offered to come with me. I told them all no. I stayed home. I sat in my kitchen at the table where my husband had told me to move everything. I made tea. Outside the window, the April snow was melting off the roof of the garage and running in slow, clear streams along the eavestrue and dripping into the garden bed below, where the crocuses were already coming up through the last of the gray. I thought about 41 years, about the mattress and the cast iron pan, about a man who built 14 trucks from nothing and who, in the last week of his life, spent his energy not on goodbyes, but on making sure I would be all right, who had looked at our son, his own son, and understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see, and who had, in his quiet way, done the only thing he could to protect me before he ran out of time. People ask me sometimes, since everything came out, since the story got around the way stories do in a town this size, whether I'm angry, whether I'm bitter, whether losing my son on top of losing my husband is something I will ever come back from. I tell them the truth, which is that I don't know yet. I'm 64 years old. I have a good solicitor and a good accountant and a neighbor who brings casseroles and the business I am now running, slowly, with help, learning more about waste management contracts than I ever expected to know at this point in my life. I have the house and the rental property on Elmwood and the crocuses coming up through the gray. And I have the memory of a man who loved me carefully enough to protect me, even when he didn't have time left to explain why. That, it turns out, is more than enough to stand on. There's something I've thought about almost every day since Barry sat at my kitchen table and laid those documents out in front of me. Not the fraud, not the courtroom. What I keep coming back to is the dinner. The chicken with lemon and thyme. The way my husband put his hand over mine and said 3 words, just to be safe, and trusted that I would do what he asked without needing an explanation. He was right to trust me, and that matters more to me now than I can easily say because I think trust like that, the kind that holds even when you don't fully understand why, is something you have to earn over a lifetime. It isn't given. It's built, quietly, out of 1,000 small choices to show up honestly and do what you said you'd do. My son made different choices. For 3 years, he built something in secret. Emails sent under a false name, a company registered to hide what it was, a slow and deliberate attempt to damage what his father had spent his life creating. And here is what I've had to sit with. He didn't do that because he was stupid or impulsive or desperate. He did it because he thought he was smart enough to get away with it. He had the intelligence to construct something complicated. He just used it without any care for what it cost other people, including his own father. That's the part that still catches me. Intelligence without conscience isn't wisdom. It's just a sharper tool for doing harm. What saved me wasn't luck. My husband saw something I hadn't allowed myself to see, and instead of panicking, he thought clearly. He went to a solicitor. He signed documents. He made sure the transfers were witnessed and properly recorded. He protected us the way he'd always protected us. Not with drama, but with careful, deliberate action taken while he still had time. That kind of clear-headedness in a frightening moment is something I don't think I fully appreciated until I had to rely on it after he was gone. And then there was the year after, the lawyer's letters and the OPP interviews and the financial review and all the months of not knowing how it would end. I won't pretend that was easy. There were mornings I sat at that kitchen table and couldn't see the point of getting up. But I got up. I called Barry. I went to Orangeville. I learned more about waste management contracts than I ever wanted to know. I kept going. Not because I felt strong, but because I decided, one day at a time, that I wasn't going to let what my son did become the end of the story my husband and I had built together. I think that's what it comes down to, in the end. Doing right by the people who trusted you. Thinking clearly when everything in you wants to fall apart. And finding the stubbornness, the plain, unglamorous stubbornness, to keep standing when the floor has gone out from under you. The crocuses came up again this spring, same as last year, same as they always do. I'm still here.